This is a story of Thomas and Catherine Andrews, Furnas County pioneers. They immigrated from Canada in 1865 and farmed in Iowa for several years before settling in Nebraska. Much of this presentation's content comes from the autobiographical account written by Catherine called From East to West. There is some additional content from her daughter Agnes Andrews Zimmerman, known as Aggie, in an account titled The Taming of a New Frontier. Our matriarch's story starts in 1831 with the immigration of her parents Archibald Munn and Jane McIntaggart, as well as Catherine's maternal grandparents Donald McIntaggart and Catherine Johnson from North Knapdale, Argyll in western Scotland to Canada. This was prior to the infamous clearances in Argyll. The Munns and McIntaggarts sailed to Quebec City from Greenock, Scotland in August of 1831. They made their way down the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario to Toronto, eventually settling in Eckford, Upper Canada, now Ontario. Catherine was born in Eckford in 1838 to Archibald and Jane Munn. Eckford is a little north of the north shore of Lake Erie and southwest of London, Ontario. It is partway between Toronto and Windsor, Detroit. Local cemeteries are the final resting place of the Munns, McIntaggarts, and Clarks, whose daughter Mary Alice married Thomas and Catherine's son Dan in 1900. Catherine's mother, Jane, dies in childbirth when Catherine is 2. Catherine lives with her maternal grandparents, the McIntaggarts, later known as McTaggart. It was a lonely childhood except for her McDougall cousins and beloved Aunt Agnes Livingston. Her only full sibling, her older brother Duncan, stays with her father, Archie. Archie is not made welcome by his mother-in-law. Visits to his daughter cease. Archie kept farming in Eckford and married his wife Jane's cousin. He had more children. Duncan captained the ship Mary Roe. As a young man, he was in Tennessee for a time. Later, he married and settled back in Ontario, where he worked as a carpenter. Catherine visits her father later in life and finds he is not the scoundrel that her grandmother McIntaggart made him out to be. Duncan visited her and her family in Nebraska. Catherine's son Thomas Jr. proudly owned Duncan's captain's chair. Thomas Andrew Jr. is born in 1840 to Thomas Sr. and Anne Andrew in Biddeford, Devon, England. The surname was changed to Andrews when the family immigrated in 1850. Catherine writes, Thomas seemed to be born with a natural love for the soil and good stock, so he lived a greater part of the time with his grandmother at Parkham. Our homestead here in Nebraska still proudly bears the name of Parkham. In 1850, when Thomas is 10, the Andrew family sail from Liverpool to New York on the packet ship Garrick. Family lore states that the Andrews left England to avoid trouble with the law. In one version, a neighbor borrowed their dog and was caught poaching on an aristocrat's land. As owner of the dog, Thomas Sr. was considered equally responsible and could be executed. Anne Andrew gives birth to a boy on board. He is named Garrick after the ship. Many years later, Thomas's brother Garrick visits the Andrew family in Nebraska and has a nephew namesake. By 1851, the family is near Toronto, Ontario. The ship Garrick was named for a very famous English actor, David Garrick. On the Garrick's passenger list, Andrew was Andrews. Was this an error or intentional? Either way, the new spelling stuck. In 1850 or 1851, the Andrew family makes their way from New York to Canada. They settle near Toronto, the capital of the United Province of Canada, from 1849 to 1852. Its population was 25,000. According to the 1851 census, most of the Andrew family lives in Markham, just northeast of Toronto. Thomas Jr. and Fanny are not far away. 11-year-old Thomas Jr. is east of Toronto in Scarborough. His younger sister, Fanny, is in Whitchurch, a bit north of Markham. In 1856, the Andrews family moved to the backwoods of Eckford. At the age of 16, Thomas Jr. runs a farm on the Thames River for his father with the help of a younger sister, possibly Fanny. Thomas wins prizes at local fairs for his stock and plowing. Thomas announced to his parents his intention to marry. According to Catherine, they then informed him that no addition to their family was desirable. After 6 months, he left his father's home with but the clothes he wore, never to return, only for short visits at long intervals. Thomas and Catherine marry in 1862. The couple worked for relatives. They built a cabin on some unimproved land. Their principal crop was potatoes, which sold for only 10 cents per bushel. Thomas traded potatoes for stock. He made feed from grain he raised, potatoes, oats, and peas. The sale of this stock to the butcher funded their immigration to the Missouri River, a place Thomas had long wanted to see. Thomas and Catherine have 2 sons. Thomas and Catherine make the decision to immigrate to the U.S. What do you think motivated them to do so? Catherine writes, in 1865, the last year of the Civil War, Canada was overrun with refugees from both the North and the South. Many worked for their board, which made times very hard and trying for the wage earner. Here we have one of the major reasons for them to immigrate. The route to the U.S. takes the Andrews through Windsor, Ontario, where they cross the river to Detroit. Catherine's daughter Aggie writes, at Windsor, Ontario, preparatory to entering the United States, they were dissuaded by well-meaning people to change their plans and not go into such a lawless country, saying they were killing each other in cold blood and that there was no law, only mob law. But my parents were determined to go, and go they did. Contrary to the predictions of these good, kind people, they never regretted coming to the States to find and seek a home. While in Chicago, a wealthy man offers Thomas $1,100 to buy his son's release from Army service for the 3rd time, meaning that Thomas would take the son's place. Thomas pleads his case to Catherine. Katie, darling, will you take our 2 wee sons and go back to Canada? And Aggie writes, usually the Katie darling won the day for my father, but not this time, for my little Scotch mother said, indeed I will not. I am staying right here, and if you are killed, I will see that our sons become American citizens. During their time on a rented stock farm near Morristown, Illinois, President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated April 15, 1865. Once their crops were harvested, Thomas traded their good horses and wagon for a cheaper outfit and some cash to continue to Iowa. He later remarked that he funded the trip by trading off everything but my family and dog. The Andrews traveled to Iowa. When fording a river, all are thrown in but none is harmed. An Irish railway gang uses ropes to pull the family out of the water. On August 1, 1865, they arrive in Council Bluffs in the Missouri Valley, 30 miles from the cornfields of their next home, California Junction. The Andrews are a mile from the eastern Nebraska border. They rent a farm here for 2 years. In 1867, the Andrews purchased 80 acres to start their own farm for $1.25 per acre, approximately $23.40 in 1915 dollars. It is a settlement of close-knit young families. Time in Iowa is very fondly remembered by Catherine. Donald Dan Andrews is born ancestor of this reunion. The only issue seems to have been ague, malaria. It was chills and fever thought to be caused by swamps before drainage occurred. Thomas and some of his neighbors supply the Union Pacific Railroad with cottonwood ties for about $1 per tie, about $19 in 1915 money. The ties are floated down the Missouri to Omaha. In 1870, Thomas starts to import stock from eastern Canada. His success prompts his father to urge Thomas to return to Canada to help purchase a farm. Thomas declines. Newborn Jimmy, twin of Mary Alice, dies. He is buried in Rose Hill Cemetery in Missouri Valley. He is the first of 2 Andrews children not to survive infancy. Catherine visits our people in Ontario in 1872 with her three youngest children, Jane, Dan, and Mary. They dress in style to reflect their current affluence with approximately 42 head of imported cattle. Kind neighbors help Catherine sew the children's new outfits. The reception that Catherine receives in Ontario leads her to advise young people to strike out in the world away from your relatives.
The 7 years we spent in Harrison County, Iowa, were years of peace, plenty, and contentment, but for one thing, ague. This was before drainage of the land was accomplished, and the many swamps caused chills and fever. No one was exempt, and there was no warning when an attack might come. Often during a threshing, the crew would be happy and jovial. Then perhaps one man would become afflicted with terrible shaking, and soon all followed his example. Then work would be at a standstill until recovery of part or all of the crew. One can be so ill, first the chill, then the fever. We heard of a wonderful valley in southwest Nebraska on the Republican River where sickness of this nature could not exist, and I often wondered how anything else did. In June 1873, my husband, in company with several other men, set out to find and see this valley. It had been a wet spring, and they returned with glowing accounts of the beauty of the country. So in August, I think it was the 8th day, we again loaded our wagons, this time too, and began the trek. By now we had 80 head of cattle and some extra good horses. Our land we sold. Goodbye, and God bless you, dear old Iowa. You gave me the first real home I ever knew. Had I but known what the years ahead of me in Nebraska would mean, my feet would have remained firmly planted on your soil, and I would have endured the shaking ague with the rest. Chapter 9. Desolation. The 3 weeks of travel in the hot burning sun was probably uneventful enough. We saw a great many wounded Indians returning from the massacre, a little west of where we were bound for. Nice encouraging prospects, was it not? One day I was driving one of the teams, and with me were my 2 young daughters and 1 small son. On the top of a steep hill with a forbidding canyon beneath, I must have been seized with a sudden premonition of the desolation ahead, for I stopped my horses. The men ahead came back to see why I was not coming. I said, "I cannot go any farther. Bring me my 2 sons in the wagon ahead, for I'm going back." "Going back where?" my husband said. And I replied, "To my good friends in Iowa. I cannot take my children away from churches and schools." "Oh," he said, "just wait until you see the beautiful valley we are journeying to." Well, the beautiful valley he referred to proved to be nothing short of an arid desert when we reached it. A little farther on, the day following this outbreak in rebellion on my part, there appeared to our vision many forms, which seemed to be in motion. The riders ahead came back and told me there was a band of Indians moving toward us. The Indians proved to be surveyors organizing and laying out Gosper County, and I think the county received its name the same day. On the 1st day of September, 1873, we arrived on the north bank of the river. We rested one day and then crossed over to where I now reside. It had not rained all summer, and the grasshoppers had denuded the valley. It certainly looked the desert it was. There were a few log cabins and dugouts dug in the banks. Some were dug on level ground with steps to descend, which, in rainy weather, was anything but pleasant. The wells were shallow, and the water tasted strong of alkali. We slept in the box of our wagons, placing them on the ground and covering with the covered tops. For kitchen and dining room, we made a shelter of brush and lumber. We lived in this style for 6 long weeks. By this time we had a dugout made with windows and doors and a floor. This was quite a cozy apartment until spring. Then the snakes became a little too familiar. They loved to crawl around the windows as much as to say, "We were here first." On December 14, a little dark-eyed baby girl came to live with us. She was ushered into the world without aid of doctor or nurse. Only my husband's capable hands administered to her and myself. Here we were with 6 children, the eldest barely 11 years of age, in a nest of horse thieves and other low-down characters. equally, if not more so, as dangerous. Many were escaped fugitives from justice in the East. It was a risk and a hardship to watch your possessions, nerve-wracking to sleep near your stock with gun in hand. One of our neighbors had all his horses stolen in the fall of 1874, and along with his, a beautiful chestnut bay mare of ours was taken. The searching never revealed where they were. Never a trace of them was discovered. The horse thieves received so much help from the unscrupulous ones, who always settle in a new country, but flee ahead of civilization. The only settlers who could rest in peace were those who had only oxen. One day my two small sons were playing near the canyon, when a large old buffalo with mane matted together and with cockleburs obstructing his sight came right down over the bank upon them. It was hard to know which was more frightened, the children or the buffalo. We used a great deal of buffalo meat in those days, but we also had plenty of beef and pork. How we did miss fruit! Later we had plenty of molasses, which supplanted fruit. Pioneer life teaches resourcefulness, and many were the delectable concoctions we served from molasses. The year following 1874 was not plentiful in crops. Some of the men were forced to go away in search of work so as to provide food and clothing for their families. Such an alarm of poverty and famine that spread through the settlement. Some new people moved in, and how we did welcome them, for they were good people and real builders, both spiritually and materially. The few settlers organized a school district that fall and built a sod schoolhouse. This was the 11th school district in the county. Worthy Crippen, a young man who had come out from Ohio and homesteaded, was hired to teach the school. There was no lack of youngsters in this assembly. There were the Ickers, Carashus the Mala, Wesley, Owen, Hardin, and Andrews families. And as I think back on it now, Mr. Crippen's time must have been well occupied. This same year, Mr. Finch had moved to a small cabin near where the city of Cambridge is now located, and had a shoe-repairing shop in this cabin. His daughter Minnie also taught school in the same building. She afterwards taught in Arapahoe. 1876 was a most terrifying year, as frost, drought, and grasshoppers took all we had. Many moved away, and our country seemed almost deserted. In 1877, there was a rumor of gold being discovered in the Black Hills. Some went from here, but had they remained and eaten cornbread with the rest of us, they would have fared better. A few days before Christmas, my husband made a trip to Plum Creek, now Lexington, to purchase a few necessary things. Among his purchases were some apples, which he said would be a treat for the children for their bare school lunches. I couldn't endure the thought of the other children in school seeing these apples and having none. So I decided to make the precious fruit into pies, where they would be less noticeable. I think I made 7 or 8 pies. That night, New Year's Eve, we were surprised by a lively bunch of our neighbors, some coming a distance of 10 miles or more. After the merrymaking and games, I served the pies for midnight lunch. One night we were awakened by a rap on the door. We were snugly asleep in our beds, and as was customary, my husband asked, "Who is there?" A name unknown to us was given, and a request for shelter for the night. When my husband admitted him, he unstrapped his guns and handed them over. I arose and prepared a bed for him. The next morning after breakfast, he said he would be moving on. So my husband gave him his guns. He was a very entertaining and well-educated man, very polite and considerate. We afterward learned he was the most cold-blooded murderer of the outlaws that roamed the prairie at the time, and a deadly shot. There was more raised in 1878 than any year since our coming to Nebraska. All were happy over the good crops, but in October, rumors of Indians on the warpath began to disturb the settler. During the 5 years we had been here, we had heard similar reports. At first it did not alarm us greatly. My husband and his young brother, visiting here from Canada, had gone to Medicine Creek to look after the cattle, and see how the grazing was holding up, etc. I was alone with the children. About 11 o'clock one forenoon, a hatless rider came galloping by, and shouted to us to flee to a certain log house, where Cambridge is now. He told us a band of Indians had been seen near Wilsonville and might come on us at any minute. In reality, what they had seen was a herd of Texas cattle. I had just taken a baking of bread from the oven. My oldest daughter was but 12 years of age, but the bravest girl I ever knew. It seems that she did everything. I was not a good rider, and as she was an excellent horsewoman, she took the two little ones with her on the horse. The rest of us trudged along with our bread and some bedding to the fort. There we found about 50 of the settlers gathered to fortify themselves against the savages. Such confusion and chaos! It was a restless, nervous crowd of women and children and men making bullets, expecting any minute to be advised by the scouts that the Indians were coming. There were sentinels who rested in shifts. One guard, I fancy I can hear him today, walked and sang at the top of his voice, "Hold the fort, for I am coming." Our safety was then assured. We remained at the fort 2 nights and 1 day, waiting for the band of Indians that never came. When my husband heard of the Indian rumor, he hurried home and found us not there. But we came soon after, a tired and weary bunch. On our return home, we continued vigorously at our work, for there was much to do caring for our abundant crop. But in 2 days' time, a terrible prairie fire swept the country, leaving nothing but desolation. Again, my husband started back to look after his stock on the creek. Then came the awful fire. All morning the atmosphere held a peculiar haze, and breathing was a little difficult. But almost without warning we saw the angry flames. There was so little time in which to do anything. But again the bravery of my young daughter displayed itself. She was the commander, and we all obeyed. She seemed to know just what to do. She protected the younger children from the cruel smoke with quilts, forgetting herself entirely. It seemed that almost at once I heard my husband's voice. He had turned back and ridden through smoke and cinders. Such a sight as he was, and I guess we were too. "Are you all here?" he said. That was the first remembrance I had of Danny. No, Dan was not there. Where had he gone, and how had he escaped Jane's strong hand when she barred windows and doors? My husband said, "I'll go out and find the little body." Outside he met Danny. He had been to the canyon and lain face downward while the angry flames swept over him. Then, using his own language, had brought water to put out the fire on the house. He had his hat partly full of water. Well, this meant that all of our feed crops, chickens and pigs, were burned. We probably were more fortunate than many, because our house did not burn. It had caught fire in several places, but was easily extinguished. Many lost everything, homes, bedding, and all the stock they owned. We were compelled to sell our stock at a sacrifice, for there was no feed. We had a beautiful grove of valuable trees burned to the ground. It seems to be the common rule that one trouble follows another, but the early settlers in Furnas County seemed to have dozens follow each other. In the winter, a terrible epidemic of diphtheria broke out. There were no families exempt from the monster. Mourning darkened the homes of many. We were fortunate, as our children were stricken but recovered. Again, my husband's skillful hands ministered to the sick. He was unwearied and unafraid. Crude little coffins were fashioned of pine by the hands of Mr. Owen, and dear little forms were laid to rest. Through striving, privations, and women's tears comes civilization. The year of 1879 found a great many new people moving in and around where Cambridge now is. Mr. Pickle and a young man by the name of Charles Winters opened up a new industry for us on the Medicine, a flour mill. Mrs. Pickle kept a few groceries in their log house. Afterwards, she was our postmistress. Previous to that time, the mail had been taken care of by Mrs. Slater. Her sole equipment for the handling the mail was a wooden cracker box. We moved to a new house, partly log and partly frame, with 2 large porches, one in front and one in the rear. We were really beginning to live. Now the historical 70s are ended. It is 1880. Although our crops were very poor that year, conditions were much improved by people moving in with money and starting to build where Cambridge now is located. The poor town bore so many names: Pickleville, Scratchpot City, and Medicine, until it finally received the dignified name of Cambridge. By this time the railroad was being built. The years following were good crop years. I made another trip to my eastern homeland, bringing back with me slips of trees. I cared for and watered them and watched the results with triumph. A row of maple and Lombardy poplar trees adorned our yards. We planted currants, gooseberries, and the most luscious of fruits, the June strawberry. A master of music came to our little community and organized a singing school. How proud we were when our children learned to sing by note. A frame schoolhouse replaced the little old soddy. Our teachers were of the best to be obtained, and we watched the development of the lovely young men and women of our community with pride and joy. In 1888, my husband made a trip to England to import cattle. On the boat going over, he contracted typhoid fever and remained in his old home in Bideford, a very sick man. But he was finally restored to us. Moving on to the 90s, we find the Republican Valley showing signs of improvement. Again dry years came. 1894 was a complete failure. Business in and about our little city was paralyzed. Land had no value, and for a time it seemed our home, that we had worked so hard for, was toppling. But with the aid of a good friend in the East, we were loaned money, which enabled us to transport our horses and cattle to Kansas, where feed was plentiful for the winter.
Success comes to Thomas Andrews in the 1900s. In 1907, Thomas is appointed judge of shorthorn cattle at Portland, Oregon. 1909 sees Thomas sent on a like commission to Salt Lake City. He and Governor Schallenberger hold several successful sales. Thomas dies of pneumonia in 1914. The obituary of this pioneer settler stated, "He loved animal life and he studied nature. He delighted in the joy of daily work upon the farm and his devotion to all that makes for agricultural betterment. He is remembered in the community for his pioneering efforts to introduce purebred shorthorn cattle and Clydesdale horses. His industriousness, strength, dependability, integrity, and aggressiveness are also remarked upon. Aggie remembers her father as strict but very affectionate and demonstrative. My father received me with wide open arms, and how often I found comfort and solace in those wide open arms from childhood's sorrows." Thomas is inducted into the Nebraska Hall of Agricultural Achievement in 1917, a few years after his death. In January 1918, Catherine delivers an address to the NHAA giving account of her husband's life. Catherine continued to live at Parkham with youngest daughter Aggie, while son Thomas Jr. farmed on part of the estate. Around 1929, after Aggie married, Catherine went to live with her daughter, Catherine McCarl, in McCook. Catherine died in 1927 at the age of 89. Aggie calls her mother a wonderful character, much loved mother of the prairie. Catherine was mother to 11 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. When my mother got ready to make her social calls, either my father or one of my brothers brought her well-groomed mare to the front gate and helped her mount side saddle. Her brown riding habit was draped about her beautiful lithe body, and the family stood and watched and admired her ride away on her errands of mercy. Catherine concludes her autobiography from east to west. "Today I'm going down the valley, facing the sunset and evening star, and I hear a voice calling, 'Come, Katie.' Yes, yes, I'm coming. God bless the Republican Valley. Though it has caused me many tears and heartaches, yet it is home sweet, sweet home." During the cruel flood of the Republican River in 1935, the Andrews home was destroyed, and Catherine's Lombardy poplar and maple trees were uprooted. Aggie wondered if her mother from her new home saw this catastrophe upon the work of her hands. This slide shows the river near the homestead and is a beautiful sight. Thank you to Reed Stagemeyer for this footage. Thanks to Dennis Andrews for his initiative and enthusiasm that spearheaded this celebration. Thanks also to the organizing committee of Diane Schultz, Leanne Braille, and Wendy McPhee. The internet is a wonderful thing that made the different distances between us not an issue. The committee thanks the many who helped this celebration happen. Wendy is indebted to her Aunt Connie Andrews for her generous sharing of family history and images many years ago, very helpful with the grade 4 family tree projects. And Cousin Keith Andrews for additional family history information and images that improves this presentation.